Welcome to this next session on wars. In the first section, we talked about the definition of war and the nature of war, how to understand war, what war actually is. Now, in this section, we will talk about the theories of war. So, war or conflict among states is something which is not very unusual in the international arena. War is something which is bound to happen in the international arena, and that we have been seeing since the advent of human civilization. And the reason is that there is a difference among states in preferred outcomes in a conflict situation. In such a situation of conflict, states develop certain capabilities. And why they develop these capabilities? Their purpose is to get an advantage, to get a more favorable outcome in their favor than they would get without such a leverage. So they understand that if they have relatively lesser capabilities, then in that situation of conflict, the outcome is not going to be favorable to them. So the more capable they are in terms of their potential, the probability of getting a more favorable outcome increases. So whether fair or unfair, the ultimate outcome of a bargaining process is a settlement of that specific conflict. So whatever eventually happens after a conflict, whether it settles this way or that way, that would obviously depend to a large extent upon the relative capabilities of the actors involved in that conflict. And that is something which all actors in the international political arena understand. So whenever a state intends to go to war or it faces the possibility of a war, it is always trying to develop its relative capabilities in relation to the adversary at hand or the potential adversaries, because they know that this will determine the outcome of the conflict which is ensuing or the conflict which is likely to come out in future. So violence actually is an effective kind of leverage in a bargaining situations, and therefore states develop capabilities so that when they have to use violence in an international conflict, they are better off eventually. Although this capability would not always be necessarily used. And in many of the international conflicts, a state would not necessarily be called upon to use violence. The conflict might be resolved in other ways. But the capability which the state has is something which the state knows that it would be called upon to use if a certain conflict goes out of hand, means there is a situation where the use of force or the use of violence or the resort to violence becomes inevitable. In that situation, the capabilities which a state has would come good for that state, or which will be, rather, it would be of use to that state to settle that conflict in its favor. Now, why wars happen, broadly speaking, is a very big question which has confronted scholars and academics who have been writing in this field of war and conflict. What we have come to understand with time and after long engagement with the discipline, that there could be some specific causes particular to a conflict. So if there is a conflict situation happening in some part of the world, there could be some specific reason for that conflict. But there could also be certain general causes through which you can look at almost all conflicts in the world. And these general causes, or people who are talking about these general causes, would concentrate upon some general explanations to explain all these violent conflict situations in the world. There have been many theories which have been given, and there are some levels of analysis which have been outlined by scholars which can help us to understand the causes of war. So we need to look at all these levels of analysis, and none of these levels of analysis is complete or can provide a holistic understanding of why wars occur, but all of them contain an element of truth. So if we look at all these explanations holistically, they help us to give us a fair idea about why and how do wars take place in the international political arena. So the first analysis here is the individual level analysis. It reflects upon the rational decisions of leaders. And the argument is that going to war is a rational choice of national leaders and the leadership, if it is several people who are in the leadership position. Another theory says that when there are deviations by individual leaders in the rational decision-making process, it leads to war. So there are these, two conflicting explanations. One explanation would argue that states would rationally calculate, and on the basis of their rational calculations, they would decide that going to war at this point of time is something very beneficial for them. Whereas the other explanation is arguing that if states were to act rationally, they would not go to war. But sometimes leaders who are at the helm of affairs in a particular country deviate from this rational logic for different reasons. And because of that, they would decide to go to war. They have outlined these reasons. For example, it could be cognitive bias. That is the bias in understanding. So in a certain situation, you would have a certain understanding or perception or knowledge or cognition about that particular situation or about the adversary. And because of that cognitive bias which you have, which you think is your own rationality, you eventually decide to go to war. So that bias is something which leads countries to a war situation, and that is something very subjective, because biases are bound to be subjective. They also say that it could be the consequence of a group think. For example, there is a group of leaders who are at the top, or maybe there is one leader at the top who is surrounded by a group of advisors. And most of those people, or almost all the people in that coterie, have got the same kind of thinking. And because most of the people have the same kind of thinking, so the same ideas resonate in that group. Somebody comes up with an idea and it bounces back to that group, and some other person says something else, it again bounces back, and they are saying the same thing virtually. So what happens, that some kind of a group thing means common logic, common understanding develops, and that affects the decision making of the leader. So that group think might not be very rational. It could be guided by the biases of these people, by the prejudices they hold, by the ideological orientations they have, by the kind of socialization they have gone through. There could be a variety of factors, and because of that, a certain kind of thinking or a thought process operates at the level of leaders, which could be very delinked from the ground realities. But that is what matters, because eventually the decision to go to war or not to go to war for a country would depend on the leadership which is there, even if it is a democratic country. So that group think, would sometimes make the leader, all leaders at the top, to go to war, even if rationally, that might not have been the best decision for that leader or the leaders to take. So sometimes ethnic hatred, that group has so much of hatred against the other group or groups that it clouds their thinking. It does not allow them to think very rationally. It was very classically illustrated in the year 1977 when the Bangladesh war took place, where there was such a strong ethnic hatred of the people or the leadership which today is in Pakistan and the erstwhile East Pakistan, that they could not digest the fact that somebody who has been elected in a general election but happens to be from East Pakistan should become the Prime Minister of the country. So these people who are in that area of Pakistan today, which is called as Pakistan, they did not tolerate that, and eventually it led to a war and the secession of East Pakistan from the mainland Pakistan, and today it is a new country called as Bangladesh. That could also be the consequence of a tendency towards violence in human nature. And that could also lead us to the point of using violence to solve a conflict. So sometimes that tendency in human nature to use force and violence to get things done the way you want, that could also be the dominant factor which might lead certain leaders to try to use force or violence to solve the conflict or try to solve a conflict the way they want. But these are those, or there are, a lot of people, those who contest these explanations and argue that some wars clearly reflect rational calculations of national leaders, whereas some others are clearly short-sighted, or they could be mistakes, if you look at them in hindsight. Some leaders could be more prone to go to war to get a favorable result of a conflict. But it is difficult to say that which leaders would do that. Sometimes apparently peaceful leaders may lead a country to war. So there could be someone like, say, Adolf Hitler, who was very open in his support for war as an important, useful instrument of national policy. And therefore, he went on, launching expedition after expedition against other countries of the world. So that is one kind of a leader, maybe if you can typecast Hitler into a certain kind of a category, that he was given to that kind of a thinking and he actually advocated that. He was in favor of war and he said war is a good thing, and therefore he was more prone to go to war, obviously. And there are many other leaders like him in the history of the world. But there could be a lot of other leaders, who are apparently peaceful, but they would still go to war. So it all depends, upon a certain situation in which a country is, So sometimes the leader would face a certain situation where she would not have an option but to go to war, And again, you can take the example of the Bangladesh war, when this situation happened, and the forces of Pakistan started committing untold miseries and all kinds of, human rights violations against people in East Pakistan, and there was open killing of people and all kinds of use of violence, unspeakable violence. Then the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi decided that it is a bit too much and we need to intervene. So it was a conflict within a country, of course, but India intervened, and there was a war which ensued, which is known as the 1971 war. So we went to a war whereby, in a situation where India did not have any intention of going to war, and we just went there to resolve a certain problem, and maybe there were certain strategic advantages which our policymakers saw in that kind of an intervention, but we went to war even if our leadership had all kinds of, peaceful objectives, and they had no intention of, launching any kind of an attack on any other country. The other analysis is at the domestic level, which is known as the domestic level analysis. It points to the feature or a particular feature of a state or certain societies that make them more or less susceptible to use violence to solve a particular conflict. For example, the Marxists would usually argue that it is capitalist states and societies which are more willing to go to war in their greed to accumulate more and more capital, or during the colonial and imperial times in the greed to occupy more and more territories, to colonize them for their economic exploitation. So they used all kinds of means and of course violence and force to do that. So inevitably, according to Marxists, capitalist states are bound to go to war. But if you look from the other side, the West would argue that totalitarian communist states are more prone to go to war because it is the leaders who have to decide whether a country has to go to war or not. It is not the people of the country who decide because it is a totalitarian system, and a megalomaniac leader like Putin might, for example, decide to go to war and launch an expedition against Ukraine, and he does not have to think what the people of the country would decide because all the powers are concentrated in the totalitarian leadership. So the West would argue that this is the kind of state which is more prone to go to war. However, if we look at the history of the world, even the history of the world in the last 2-3 centuries, we would find that it is both kinds of states who have frequently gone to war. So, if the Marxist or the communist countries have gone to war very easily, the number of wars which the Western countries have fought, and even after they became democratic, maybe would be more in numbers. So their record is equally black. So therefore, this kind of explanation or the counter explanations which comes from both sides, they do not, meet the test of actuality. So when you look at the events, which unfolded in international politics, we find that both these claims are without basis. Then there is the democratic peace theory, From the theoretical point of view, Michael Dole came up with the democratic peace thesis, where the argument is that democratic countries do not fight with each other. So therefore, if two countries are democratic, they will not fight with each other. So it is only non-democratic countries, or maybe one democratic country and the other non-democratic country, which would fight, because democratic countries it would be very difficult for a democratic country to decide to go to war, because it is the people who decide, and people would rarely agree to war so easily. But in an authoritarian or a totalitarian system, it is easier for leaders to decide to go to war. So here Michael Dole is talking about extending the zone of peace, that if more and more countries of the world become democratic or they adopt the democratic system, the possibility of war in the world would recede and we will be living in a more peaceful world. So again, this democratic peace theory does not stand the test of scrutiny to a great extent. Because on the one hand, if democratic countries are not fighting with each other, the reason could be one, that they are mostly prosperous countries, they are rich countries, developed societies, and therefore the issues for which countries usually do go to war are not there. So therefore, at least in the last after the Second World War, you do not find instances of these democratic countries of the West going to war with each other. But on the other hand, many of the wars which have been inflicted on the so-called Third World have been inflicted on them by these so-called developed countries or democratic countries of the world. So these are the wars in which the war or the conflict has not been started by these developing countries, but the wars which have been inflicted upon them by the democratic countries or the industrialized Western countries. So therefore, one has a lot of issues with the explanation of Michael Dole. So therefore, in general, the potential and tendency to go to war is quite universal, and you cannot rather make it specific to a particular type. What can also be said in this, that there are some societies which could be more prone to going to war as compared to others. And there could be some societies which could change with time. For example, if you look at a country like Japan, the possibility and the probability of Japan going to war was much more before the Second World War. But after the Second World War, we find that the way Japan has conducted itself in the international arena, it is much less prone to go to war as compared to most of the countries in the world. So that is how that society has changed. There could be many reasons for that change, but if you look at the actuality, you would find that that change has nevertheless come about. The third explanation could be the interstate level analysis or explanation. There are several explanations here. For example, one is the power transition theory that says that conflicts lead to big wars in situations where power is relatively equally distributed, and a rising power in that situation is willing to overtake a declining hegemon. So, there is a hegemon, and that hegemon is declining, and that situation is sensed by some country which is very ambitious and which wants to become the hegemon itself. So, therefore, that country, that ambitious country, that rising power might take certain actions which might precipitate a conflict or lead to a war. Then the deterrence theory says that wars are avoided when power is built up and there is a threat of use of weapons on both sides. So, side A or country A fears that it should not go to war because country B has got a lot of weaponry or potential and it might inflict very serious damage on it. Similarly, country A thinks, or similarly country B thinks that it should also not start a war because A has the capacity to inflict very serious damage on it. So, because of that, none of those countries start a war. So, that is the situation of deterrence and balance. And that is reached because both countries are heavily armed. But on the other hand, the logic of arms race holds that arms race would inevitably lead to war, and it will not prevent it, because when countries will have a lot of weapons and they would be involved in an arms race, then what will happen of the weapons? Eventually the weapons are going to be used. So the possibility of war is more in countries which are enmeshed in an arms race rather than in countries which have relatively lesser weapons and which are not in a competition with each other to acquire more and more weapons. However, there is no unanimity on any of these explanations. They are explanations in their own right, but they are not universally accepted. However, in present times, it is being argued that trade relations, democratic structures in country, and the historical relations which countries have with each other do impact the possibility of use of force in settling disputes. So, for example, if there is some kind of a dispute between America and Canada, so the kind of historical relations they have and the kind of trade relations they have, so that historical context and the trade relations and the other cultural relations do ensure that the possibility of use of force is minimal between these two countries. Whereas on the other hand, if these factors are to the disadvantage of the adversaries, for example, in our case in relation to India and Pakistan, so all these factors are negative factors for us. We have very rather ugly historical past. We have very rather scanty kind of trade relations. Democratic structures are there in India, but one knows what is the kind of democratic structure, in Pakistan. So these factors are negative factors here, and therefore the possibility of use of force in settling a dispute is always imminent in the case of these two countries. So that is something, which can be understood in general terms. Finally, the level of analysis is at the global level. If you look at it at the global level, some people would argue that major wars are cyclical. Although there are various explanations within the cyclical theories, and it can only explain the general tendency towards war in the international system, but it cannot give us a strong theoretical basis to actually understand why wars or major wars take place in the world. Another theory at the global level is the theory of linear long-term change. That war as an outcome of a conflict is becoming increasingly less likely with the passage of time due to the worldwide development of technology as well as international norms. So, we have new norms coming in and every day they are getting institutionalized, and that makes, countries' decisions for going to war increasingly difficult. Some even go to the extent of arguing that it is not even usable. Means sometimes, certain weapons or certain kinds of wars are not even, worthwhile. Like nuclear weapons, or the nuclear war. Because if you were to decide or any country were to decide to start a nuclear conflict, it is going to be disastrous for everyone. So countries would not even think of usage of nuclear weapons or going for a nuclear war. Some also argue that war today is so very expensive. So for a country to go to war today is a very, very difficult decision. We have seen, how the richest countries of the world found it so very pinching, once they entered into a war with some country. The classic examples are that of US when it intervened and had a war in Iraq and then in Afghanistan, and after a long drawn conflict, the Americans realized that it is so very expensive because the kind of expenses you have to incur, economically. Earlier, the expenses in war were more physical, you lost a lot of people, they got injured, then they got killed. But today it's, of course, people are getting killed in wars, but the technology or the intervention of technology makes the war so very expensive. So therefore, some countries or most countries would think many times before entering into a war. So that is basically primarily because of the expensive nature of war. Some even say that the use of force is not a very effective thing in today's world, which is so complex and so interdependent. So if a country wants to further its interest, there are other means which are more useful, more fruitful for countries to follow. So therefore, those are the operational strategies which countries would try to explore before going to war. So there was a time centuries back when war used to be the first option for countries, if they wanted to get something done in international politics. But increasingly with the passage of time, we see that war is turning out into a last option. So countries would think many times and they would try to explore all kinds of options before deciding actually to go to war. And that is the reason why, and this is a combination of all these reasons, bring before us this fact that in today's world we see that interstate wars today become very less frequent. Although there are other forms of war which continue to manifest themselves at the international level quite frequently today. So this is an explanation, about the levels of analysis. And these levels of analysis give us a broad idea to understand, about the reasons why wars happen. Because that is the main question, which stares us in the face when we are students of international politics. That why a state or a country decides to go to war. Despite knowing all these factors which we have discussed up till now, that what are the consequences, what are the costs involved in war, but still countries decide to go to war. So in the next segment, we will talk about specifically the main causes, which lead to a situation of war between and among countries of the world. Thank you.